Hello and welcome everyone to our regular webinar at WFO. My name is Ilya Karnaukhov and I'm a Senior Development Manager at Offshore Wind, or shortly WFO. Today's webinar, Offshore Wind Market Updates, and it's my great pleasure to welcome a great panelist for today. We have Peter Brun, Global Segment Leader of Offshore Wind at DNV. We have Sharanya Kumaramurthy, Market Intelligence Manager at EIC, and we have Klingberg Jensen from Poul Schmith. So it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you today. And just before we begin, a few words about WFO. We are a nonprofit organization, a shortly business platform for offshore wind globally. We promote offshore wind, and our members represent the entire offshore wind value chain. We have international setup with offices in Hamburg, Tokyo, Taipei, and New York. And in terms of our activities, it's very straightforward. As I already said, we're as a business platform, so we promote offshore wind energy globally. We inform about offshore wind event via a number of channels, and we, of course, connect the global offshore wind community by organizing different events such as this webinar. And our main event for 2024 would be Global Summit in Barcelona, and I really encourage you all to register and attend this event. A prominent lineup of speakers is already scheduled, and the event will cover the global offshore wind policies, floating offshore wind, hydrogen supply chain, and of course finances. And all of this will be addressed by doers and makers per se in the industry. We also have at the moment over 120 members. They represent the entire supply chain of floating offshore wind. And our members from North America, from Asia, Europe, and Oceania, such as Australia. If you would like to join us, please feel free to contact me or our Managing Director, Gunnar Hersik, if you have any questions regarding the membership. So, and very briefly, a structure of this webinar. So during the first part of the webinar, we have 3 presenters, and after that, we have a Q&A session. Please feel free to use the panel on your right-hand side and just simply insert your questions. And after the presentations, I will read it to the panelists. So without any further ado, Peter, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, and hi everyone. So my name is Peter Brun. I'm the Global Offshore Wind Segment Lead in DNV. I'm speaking today out of Copenhagen. Last week we presented our new energy transition outlook, and I'm very pleased here to give you a little broader insights into the findings with a wind perspective. The energy transition outlook is something that DNV is doing every year. We are updating it in terms of what we see in the market and in terms of developments in the technologies. It is not like many other forecasts with scenarios. It is only our single forecast, our best estimate. And what we're trying to do from our company is really to use all the knowledge we have on new technology development and also our engagement in the markets, and of course also calibrating this in the economic model with all the socioeconomic impacts. So since last year, all of you know there has been quite a lot of change in the market, and it is also something that certainly is affecting the energy transition. One of the most important takeaways from this forecast this year is that we are still in the very start, in the very early phase of the energy transition. And even though we see a lot of technologies in the different markets, this transition, if we look near term by 2030, we will only be cutting our emissions with 4%. Another important takeaway this year is that the world has changed, and now energy security has really moved up on the geopolitical agenda. We all know what we're talking about here, seen from a European perspective. but we also see that this is having wider consequences throughout the world. So it is a geopolitical effect. We see that people or governments and countries are taking more protectionist approach, also making sure that they are serving their markets from own supply chains, etc. On the positive side is that especially some governments are very bold in securing that the energy transition will move forward. Here, of course, mentioning the Reduction Inflation Act in the US, but also the RE Power Green Deal policies of the EU, and also other single measures from many governments that are helping to drive forward the changes. In terms of the technologies, a lot of good news in that area. Both solar PV batteries are progressing very fast, certainly also wind. We can talk about that later in the presentation. But again, here there are also some supply chain gridlocks that are slowing down the development or making the technologies more expensive than they should be. So one of the, of course, big questions is how is it going? I mean, are we on track in terms of meeting the Paris target of 1.5 degree increase of the CO2? And here, unfortunately, according to our forecast, we are not on track. We are forecasting an increase in the temperatures towards the next century of 2.2 degrees Celsius, whereas the pathway, according to the Paris Agreement, should be 1.5. Looking on the timeline of our forecast towards 2050, it means that we will have a rise in the temperature of plus 0.15 degrees, which of course does not sound as very much, but it is the aggregated global level. What I think is more significant and worrying maybe is that the carbon budget that we have available at the moment with the current emissions will close already in 2029 if we were to stay within the Paris Agreement. The carbon budget for a increase in the temperatures of 2 degrees Celsius will close in 2055. So we need to speed up is the basic message. Also, it is good to be mindful that what is happening here in the energy transition towards not fossil fuel technologies or energy is a long journey for sure, which is also good illustrated here in this slide. As of today, we have energy from natural gas, oil, and coal, which is equivalent of 80% from those sources, and only 20% of renewables or non-fossil resources. That is going to change if the energy transition indeed will go as we forecast, and in 2050 the non-fossil energy supply will be a little beyond 50%, 52%, and fossil fuels will account for 48%. But I think it's an illustration that fossil fuel supply will still be part of the mix for quite a long time. Looking now into the power sector, it is going, I think, a little more aggressively, or a little faster, you can say. And here we are forecasting that by 2050, 68% of all electricity will come from solar and wind. You can see the different selection into floating, onshore wind, solar PV, solar and storage, and that is of course the big amount here. And then also from hydropower, bioenergy, geothermal, very, very small, and then nuclear, some gas-fired, very little oil. And also I think the good news is that that coal-fired generation in the power sector is really declining quite rapidly now. How does it look in offshore wind? It looks quite good, you can say. We are forecasting an increase of more than 20 times from where we are now, with around 70 gigawatt installed capacity in 22. And that will move up to more than 1,500 gigawatt at the mid-century, so in 2050. In offshore wind, it will be mainly coming from bottom fixed generation or technology, but 70% will be coming from the new emerging technology, floating wind, at least at the end of 2050. We of course need to talk about some of the challenges on the super short term, and here I think everyone knows what is playing in the market these days. The business case has actually changed quite radically, I would say, because of the higher interest rates and therefore the cost of capital. Also, technologies have become more expensive, and the prices from the manufacturers have gone up into double-digit price increases. Manufacturers and developers are also suffering from supply chain barriers at the moment. So actually, the own manufacturing capacity just in Europe will be running out already in 2026. And here there need to be good incentives for manufacturers to build new capacity if we should not be too dependent from outside supply. Other things which is slowing down on the super short time is the lead times of building grids, and certainly also the planning procedures in many markets. And all this, of course, will have again a bearing on also the learning curves, so the LCOE reductions in the technologies, because that is always bound very closely into the volumes that are created in the markets in order to reach economics of scale. And the last but not least, we also see that many markets and regions are using local content requirements, which again is forcing supply chains into the local market, which again has a price consequence. Because of these short-term dynamics, if we look into how this will pan out in the next coming years, and you can see that here over the next few years it will be quite bumpy. It's not going to be a straight line up. It's actually going to be a little up and down, and of course that would be a challenge, I think, for the players in the market. Certainly, one needs to have a good flexibility to do this in a good economic way. But it looks much better when we get into the end of this century towards 2030, and from 2030 onwards, it should be a pretty strong, stable growth. In terms of the markets in bottom fixed, we are looking into that also for offshore wind bottom fixed. China will eventually be the biggest market, just as we have seen for onshore wind technology, but Europe is certainly still going to be a major market, second biggest market, with 352 gigawatts by 2050. And also here over the next years, you can see that Europe will play a very important role, I would say, to get this going. Looking into floating wind, we are looking at very aggressive growth. It is really a hockey stick, but that is also coming from a super low level of less than 150 megawatt to the numbers that are mentioned here. China and Europe has changed, so we do believe that floating wind will be biggest towards 2050 in Europe, with 76 gigawatt at that time, where China will just be below 60 gigawatt, followed by North America, which is also going to be a very big market in floating wind. All which is driving this development, market or regional development, is of course the learning curves and the levelized cost of offshore wind. It has already come down quite a lot over the last 10 years by reduction of the cost of more than 40% for bottom fixed. And we're also looking into quite aggressive reductions of the LCOE for floating wind. We estimate more than 50% for floating also, which of course is also needed if we will see these volumes that we are forecasting. There's a good case for a lot of wind penetration in the energy mix in many regions. As you can see, Europe is leading with the highest penetration of wind in the mix with more than 40%, followed by Greater China with, I think, 37%, and North America with 36%. But the wind penetration in many other regions will also be quite high. You can see that the yellow dots here are where we are today in terms of wind penetration. So there's a lot of upside and market potential. For bottom fixed, we will increase every number here, every date here to 25, 29, 34, and 41, means that the capacity will double by these outlined years. Which again is an important case for the scaling of the manufacturing capacity also. Yes, and just to sum up, yes, we do have some short-term challenges in the sector, as I talked about just a minute ago. But we are also very optimistic for not least offshore wind, that it's going to be a huge growth sector in the future. And the reason for that is that offshore wind still has the potential of being even cheaper. So there's still an interesting learning curve development. It comes also in great scale, which governments needs. So it's not only a decentralized generator, it is actually big wind farms that are being built these days and in the future. And also where you have the wind resources close to load centers, it is shooting very well into a mix, maybe coming from solar, which is more fluctuating. And also we do see that there will be an important link to hydrogen, so green PTX from offshore wind is certainly also something that will be kicking the market forward. And yes, governments will be looking after offshore wind, both in terms of CFDs and also other subsidies, because they need to meet the decarbonization goals. And therefore, I think there will be ways to ensure the market development also here in the coming years, where it will be a little more challenging. Yes, so this is what I had to say today. Hopefully that was an interesting illustration to everyone. And there's more information from our energy transition outlook, which I will also in the slides give you a link to, so you can download the full material. This was just a snapshot into what it means for wind power, simply. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, great, Peter. Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview. It was great to learn all of the latest developments in the industry. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome our next speaker for today, Sharanya.
Thank you, Ilya. Hi, everyone. I'm Sharanya from the Energy Industries Council. So we're one of the largest trade associations that focuses on helping companies secure business opportunities across all energy sectors. So we have a number of our own databases and events that we hold throughout the year. And I focus on the market intelligence arm of the company. So I focus particularly on wind, so offshore and onshore wind. But today I'm going to hone in to the UK offshore wind market and try to give you a very quick overview as to what's happening in terms of CapEx data here. So if we first look at the current state of play, the UK currently has a target of 50 gigawatts to be installed by 2030, of which 5 gigawatts will come from floating offshore wind. This was set in 2022 during the energy security strategy that was released, and since then we've had one legislation come out in March this year, which was the Powering Up Britain plan, where the government has allocated £160 million for ports to improve their floating offshore wind capabilities. So of course it's quite ambitious targets, and we currently, as of yesterday, have around 14.7 gigawatts of capacity. So yesterday we saw SC Renewables and Total Energies bring their Sea Green 1 wind farm to the grid. So that's another 1,075 megawatts that's now been connected. So that's good news for the UK. But if we look at the pipeline in terms of what's to be built, currently across the whole timeline, we are tracking just over 115 gigawatts of capacity. This does include a lot of the leases and grid connections that are from companies that want to take part in the leases. So not all of this will come online. But of this capacity, around 54% of the pipeline is represented at the minute by floating offshore wind. So the UK is currently one of the leaders in floating offshore wind. So we did recently install, a few years ago, I wouldn't say recently, but a few years ago we did install the 50 megawatt Kincardine wind farm in Scotland. And just before a few weeks, we were the largest owner of operational floating offshore wind farms. But we can see this pipeline growing for floating offshore wind. And if we see the trajectory of projects throughout the next 10 years, so no capacity is going to come online now in 2023, but from 2024 onwards, if we look at the first decade, we can see that exponential growth throughout the few years, and that big surge in 2030 is primarily because of the floating offshore wind drive. We're seeing the industry now move towards commercialization at a large scale. But another reason for this big surge is the number of leases and auctions that we've seen in the UK. So the UK is very famous for its leases because that's what has fundamentally driven a lot of this capacity growth that we're seeing in the pipelines. And I've listed out some of the auctions that have recently happened on the right-hand side of this slide. So the very first auction that happened that was of big news recently was the ScotWind auction in January 2022, which is again what added that huge pipeline of large-scale floating offshore wind farms. But going on from this, the most recent win was the Innovation and Targeted Oil and Gas auction. So this is the first auction of its kind where it looked at offshore wind capacity in the Scottish North Sea that is used for decarbonising oil and gas platforms. So 4.6 gigawatts of this went for the decarbonisation aspect, and this went to the likes of Flotation Energy with its Green Vault and Senos projects. Cerulean Winds won 3 areas of 1,008 megawatts each, and Total Energies and Harbour Energy were also successful here too. The innovation arm of this auction was where small-scale wind farms could be put forward that would focus primarily on innovation and bettering the industry for floating offshore wind. So Blueflow Energy and Renantis were successful here, which will help its ScotWind projects. Simply Blue, Ørsted and Subsea 7 have their Salamander project here as well. BP have entered the floating offshore wind market in the UK here with this, where they've got a 50 megawatt Flora project, and ESB also have its 100 megawatt Malin Seawind project too. So quite a successful auction on that front. And the very next auction coming up is the Celtic Sea auction, where again for floating offshore wind, another big drive, 4.5 gigawatts will be auctioned out here, which I'll touch on more in the next slide. It's looking very positive from what I've said so far, but again, a bit of a reality check. This is a very much capacity focused, and if we look at the reality of what's actually happening, we are expecting a lot of the projects in that 2030 mark to come online to trickle into the 2030s, if not stall a bit more, simply because of the number of challenges that we're seeing. Peter has already highlighted primarily all of these, where there is that inflation crisis now, where a lot of projects can't really compete with the prices that we're seeing. And we saw this in the Contracts for Difference auction round. So this is the UK subsidy scheme, which helps finance offshore wind farm projects. In the beginning years of the Contracts for Difference scheme, we saw the price of offshore wind developments drop, which really assisted developers putting forward bids and building these wind farms. But in the last few years, the prices have continuously dropped and dropped so much that it's becoming economically unfeasible to build these wind farms, not only for the developers, but the supply chain as well. So this year we did see no bids secured in offshore wind and floating offshore wind in the UK, which is a huge kick for the industry here. But again, conversations are now happening for the next CFD round next year to see if it can move away from that price focus. And more auctions are expected to come out as well, including ScotWind 2 and more Crown Estate auctions too. So to sum it up, they are looking at offshore wind at a great detail, and it's looking very healthy on paper in terms of capacity, but a number of challenges, including permitting, grid expansion, the availability of ports, standardization for floating offshore wind. Again, all of these have been mentioned, but something to keep in mind of when we're looking at all of these pipelines. Okay, just to look into the Celtic Sea now quickly, which is the next auction. I won't go into too much detail here, but again, just to highlight the vast opportunities that are yet to come in the UK. So very recently, the UK increased the target for the capacity limit from 4 gigawatts to 4.5 gigawatts of capacity. Initially, there were 5 areas of search, which have now been refined into 4 project development areas, which have circled in red. But again, to show progress into moving away from price-led auctions, they are focusing more so on social values, so the quality and skills aspects, and also mainly port integration as well. So developers do have a lot more of an onus when putting bids forward to show how they're going to utilize and develop the ports around them for their projects. This has come with a bit of backlash because, of course, the capacity for this auction is quite small, so no developer would really want to invest so much in a port just for one project that they've got in the pipeline, but we'll see what happens on that front. And they're also announcing a rising clock auction, so they're looking more so at announcing who's taking part in the auction at each round so developers can assess their risk better rather than leaving it to the end. So a lot of progress on this auction, but the only con on this side is that we don't actually know when this auction is going to be launched and no date has been fixed. It was last said that it will be at the end of this year, but realistically, with nothing being announced, it could be looking at next year. I've listed out a number of projects as well, just to show what we're tracking on our project tracking database. This is all just in the Celtic Sea, but again, to highlight the interest here, we have a number of small scale projects, so the Erebus, Valorous, and also the Twin Hub, which secured the CFD last year. They're looking at building up offshore wind on a small scale, but if we look further down the rows, we can see the capacity increase, and these are the developers looking to take part in the auction and again create that large scale drive here. So we have a number of renewable players that are well known, such as Ørsted, RWE Renewables, SSE Renewables, and Blueflow Energy, that have secured grid connections and are looking to take part. But again, we are seeing a number of oil and gas players now making their move to the Celtic Sea. So this is the likes of BP, Equinor, Total Energies, and yep, I think I've mentioned all of them. Yes, so again, we're seeing oil and gas players moving into the Celtic Sea region for the first time. Just to highlight again, as I did with that capacity pipeline that we mentioned, a lot of these projects are just grid connections looking to take part in the auction. And there is a 1 gigawatt limit. So the size, they can have to be 1 gigawatt or more to take part in the auction. So if there's only 4.5 gigawatts of capacity, realistically 4 or 5 projects will be taking part. So a lot of these projects will not go ahead. But because there is that capability of 20 gigawatts to be auctioned in the future, if more auctions are announced, which we are waiting on, we could see more of these developers having their piece of the cake in the future. To highlight now the top developers in the UK, again, I won't highlight on this too much, but the slides will be sent around. In terms of the key developers, again, the big renewable players like Ørsted, Vattenfall, Blue Flow Energy, RW Renewables, SSE Renewables are all having big stakes here. But what I want to highlight with the UK is how, since offshore wind has taken off, the oil and gas players have now really moved into offshore wind in the UK and made their mark. And one way that they've done this is by creating joint ventures with these renewable companies. So if we look at BP have 5.9 gigawatts of capacity in the UK to be built, and they've partnered with ENBW to do this. Shell has partnered with Scottish Power Renewables for the ScotWind auction, and they have a few floating offshore wind projects under their belt with that joint venture. And similarly, Total Energies as well. Like I said in the beginning, they've brought online their Sea Green 1 project yesterday with SSE Renewables, and they've got another expansion project of that with SSE Renewables and other partnerships with Simply Blue Energy, also to bring, and Korea Generation also to bring these projects online as well. Finally, I'm going to end on this slide, looking more again at a realistic ending to this market overview. So with our supply map database, where we track all of the supply chain companies within certain regions, if we look at the UK, we can see predominantly most of our skills lie in the operation and maintenance phase, and also the feasibility, environmental studies, and the consultancy aspects of services. And this is because even though the UK is a leader in offshore wind, one of the leaders in offshore wind to date, initially the take-in of offshore wind was slow, and it impacted the growth of supply chain capabilities in the UK. There were low margins with oil and gas projects that were happening for supply chain companies in the UK to take part, and the competition was just too stark for them to move over. And this is really important because we're seeing that now with the UK as well here, where because of the inflation rates being too high, a lot of the supply chain companies that we speak to on a day-to-day are struggling to want to work in offshore wind in the UK, and are finding it more economically feasible to go back into oil and gas where margins are a lot lower. So as you can see, we don't have a lot of capabilities for the larger component manufacturing, such as turbines and foundations. And again, with the ports, a lot of our ports aren't ready for the pipeline that we saw. And installation vessels as well are a big one where we are very low. So not only is the pipeline, despite the pipeline looking good, one, we're seeing the supply chain capabilities in the UK itself not being good enough, but it's more of a global issue now as well, where inflation is affecting many countries, many sectors, and I think collectively a lot needs to be done outside of the capacity additions now to help bolster the growth of offshore wind. So on that note, I would wrap it up, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Sharanya. That's a very great overview of the UK current status and near plans. Perfect. Thank you very much. And now we're moving on to our final speaker for today. And Klint, over to you.
Thank you for hosting this seminar. I'm here to give you a brief update on the Danish offshore wind market. Just briefly about myself, I am a partner and an attorney in the law firm Poul Schmith. I worked previously with Ørsted and spending most of my time on contract negotiations for large renewable energy infrastructures. Briefly about the company, we are one of the largest law firms in Denmark with some 850 people, with 550 lawyers in total. And we advise both private market clients as well as the Danish government, where we have the position of being the sole designated legal advisor to the Danish government, a position we have held since 1936. And that also means that we assist the Danish Energy Agency with offshore wind tenders for the Danish market, and we've been part of developing the auctioning system in Denmark together with our client for this purpose. So briefly about our private practice, we also assist developers and suppliers around the world. We have assisted on more than 30 projects in a global arena. It's concentrated around Europe and US and Asia, and we assist both developers and a certain number of suppliers. Just a brief introduction to the current status of the offshore wind capacity in Denmark. We have some 2.3 gigawatt of installed capacity so far. So even though we sometimes boast that we are front runner in offshore wind, comparing to the UK market, already having installed approximately 15 gigawatt, as we just heard, it is a rather small scale that we are moving on right now. We have quite a few projects, 15 projects already established, and we will give an overview a bit later on some of the future projects. The 2030 goals are, as the rest of the world, quite aggressive in terms of the target. The target is to reach 12.9 gigawatt of capacity for offshore wind in 2030. It accounts for the combined households of both Denmark and Sweden, so we plan to be an exporter of renewable energy. And the electricity consumption that is expected over the next couple of years will also be that we will have more than 100% of renewable energy from offshore wind in 2030 and actually before. And what these numbers do not show really is that if you also take other sources of renewable energy, we will reach the 100% renewable energy target for electricity in advance of 2030, and that is, of course, really positive. Then these are just some additional facts. Since 2005, there's been 0 hours where we've not had any wind production in Denmark, and in the past 12 months, we have had for 14% of the time a wind power production that has covered 100% of the gross consumption, while for approximately half of the time, the wind power production covered 50% of the gross production. And this slide really just shows the development over the last couple of months, for the past 12 months of the split between offshore wind power and onshore wind power compared to the consumption. And I think an important point here in understanding the Danish market is the upper right-hand corner illustration of the 2 bid zones for the TSO, DK1 and DK2, and understanding that in DK1 we have the access to the west coast, where we have a great source of offshore wind power coming in. We obviously have in DK2 Copenhagen area, which is a large consumer of electricity, and currently the needs are to increase the renewable energy production for DK2, and I'll get back to that a bit later on. This is a brief overview of all the projects that we have in Denmark, both established, expected, and under construction, and then a small one, Vinterby, which is actually already decommissioned. I've circled in on 3 areas of interest, and still keeping in mind the bid zone split between DK1 and DK2. In DK1 zone of particular interest, especially for developers and maybe also suppliers, is the Energy Island project in the Danish part of the North Sea, with a potential 3 gigawatt of offshore wind coming in. That project, to give an update on that, was intended to be tendered for in September this year, but unfortunately got postponed due to recalculation of the financial elements of that project. So it's still in the planning, but it is postponed as unfortunately many other projects are also a bit delayed. Then, of course, also the Thor project, which was awarded to RWE and will account for 1 gigawatt, and I believe that is to be online in 2030, if I'm not mistaken. I've also circled in on Hesselø. That is currently a project where site investigations are ongoing. It's not tendered for yet, but that is in the planning together with the energy island in the Baltic Sea near Bornholm, Danish island in the Baltic Sea, with a capacity potential of 2 gigawatts. And when you look at the zone, the bid zone allocation between DK1 and DK2, the energy island, the Baltic Sea, may come on as a new bid zone. That's of course important for how you calculate the split of renewable energy percentage or share in the zones DK1 and DK2, which is of relevance, of course, if you are, let's say, producing e-fuels or having other Power-to-X projects where you need a high degree of renewable energy source for your products. Shortly about the Danish model, to understand that, the Danish model for auctioning of offshore wind is really resting on 4 pillars, and this is a slide I have with inspiration from the Danish Energy Agency, who is the center of developing these auctioning rounds. It is based on a strong political mandate, which has been agreed by the parliament of both sides of the parliament, so it creates a really robust decision-making support for the projects, and it's not likely to get changed, so that's a strong signal to the market. It also rests heavily on thorough planning. It's both in terms of maritime spatial planning, but it's also with regard to the planning towards the TSO, Energinet, really robust energy system planning in general. And then a key pillar is also the transparent procurement process for the auctioning. There's a recent development of having a very close market dialogue with the potential participants, and then later on with the pre-qualified bidders, and that really enables the Danish Energy Agency to make sure that the tender material is tailor-made to the specific technical and financial realities of the specific project, and that increases the interest for the tenders. I think also the last pillar, named guaranteed grid, is quite important, because certainty for timely grid connection is obviously something that creates some level of robustness for the business planning of the individual projects, and this is resting upon the Renewable Energy Act in Denmark. Briefly on the Danish one-stop shop principle, something that relieves developers from handling a lot of interfaces with different authorities is the fact that the Danish Energy Agency will act as one point of contact, and that is obviously a good thing, both in the planning process prior to tendering, but also afterwards when it comes to permitting. I think I'll just spend 5 minutes maybe on some of the key features of the recent tender for the Thor project, which was very successful, and I think some of these characteristics will be carried on into further auctioning rounds, and I'll get back to some expected trends on the further future auction rounds. The Thor tender design was really with a strong focus on cost effectiveness. That was the marching order from the political side. It was to aim at getting the lowest price through, and that worked. The auctioning, as many of you maybe know, was actually so successful that you ended up having a lottery to select the winner. It was an international competition attracting the best players from around the world. It did not have any local content requirement. It had a very strong focus on de-risking the project through market dialogues, both on tender conditions and on the technical side, and I'll get back to that. And then it had a focus on ensuring a high transparency when it comes to communication and the process, both in terms of communication, access to information, etc. So I think I'll then skip to some of the parts of the market dialogue. And for the tour tender, there was a one-day conference with approximately 100 participants. It was followed up by then 4 days of bilateral meetings with the developers that showed particular interest. And it was tailored to make sure that there was a common understanding and a sufficient level of detail in some of these themes that are listed on this slide. So especially the timetable, the subsidy scheme and the award criteria, but also some of the mechanisms in the concession agreement, especially for the penalty if you did not perform as expected, the capacity and the designated area, etc. And the dialogue was tailor-made, so the questions also went not from the market to the energy agency, but also the other way around, really requesting the market to come with information and share their thoughts on how to structure this in the best possible manner. On the technical side, the dialogue very much focused on the site investigations, what was the scope, what was the needed scope, and with some very particular discussion points on cable surveys, studies for OXOs and geotechnical investigations. But all in all, efforts to make sure that the right investigations were made to increase the certainty and robustness and transparency for the bidders prior to providing the bids. So then I'll just allow a few minutes on this. What would be the trends for future Danish offshore wind tenders? And as I already mentioned, I think some of the key features of the way to do the tour tender will definitely be carried on, but there will also be some changes, I'm sure. So the aim is on an overall level to have 6 gigawatt of capacity established in the North Sea over 3 areas and 3 nearshore areas, and then you have the 3 gigawatts that I already mentioned at Bornholm. There will be no, the expectation at least is that there will be no requirement for grid connection, but a guarantee to be able to grid connect as minimum 1 gigawatt. There's also considerations of having options to overplant in addition to the minimum capacity of 1 gigawatt. And then I think price will still remain the sole award criteria. It will be in the form of a payment to the state for having access to the area and to utilize the wind resources. I think it is expected from all sides that there will continue to be an increased demand for sustainability, life cycle analysis, how to include the nature and the design, and all of these issues. Also an increased monitoring of environmental impact. I think the really new point is that it is expected, that has been publicly disclosed as all the other points here, that there will be a requirement for 20% co-ownership by the Danish state in all future concessions, although Bornholm is not part of that. And how that will play out and the details of that remains to be seen. And I think that covers it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have a few minutes for a Q&A session. And we received a few questions. And maybe we start, the question would be, considering the current situation on the market, such as inflation, higher costs, higher interest rates, which link to projects being postponed, and especially one person mentioned the US, and then also in the UK, the action that happened last month, I believe. So what are the expectations in the cost reductions in the near future and overall higher growth for the offshore wind? So I guess we can start with Peter first, then Sharanya, and then Klint.
Yes, it is correct that on the super short term, so this year and maybe next year and even some months in the following year, there will be cost inflation, price consequences into the technology. But it's also fair to say that the raw material market is very volatile, and looking into special components and raw materials like steel, you have seen that prices have come down quite aggressively also here recently. And that is also to be expected. I think that this will pan into the component prices as we come a little further down the road. But the other side to the coin is that yes, regulators need to understand these dynamics, and therefore also that the scenario where we were in over the last 5+ years, where you were just looking into lower cost of the technologies, have been paused, and therefore, as we saw in the UK 5 round, those kind of support levels that are suggested in that market at this particular given time is not sufficient. What will happen in the market then is that you also seen from the UKI perspective is the investments will go into to cheaper technologies, so solar and onshore wind in a case like that. So this is really up to the regulators to recalibrate, I would say, the support schemes if they want this technology to move fast forward, and if not, then they're looking into delays in getting this green generation capacity online at a short term. That is the situation. It's really up to the regulators maybe to come in, and one of the things really I always is a little puzzled about is that this technology is just being treated as a competitive bidding situation. One could also look at it as critical infrastructure. And what is particular about critical infrastructure? Well, what about that is it needs to come in place at a certain time point, and therefore regulators need to deliver those framework conditions to allow this. I mean, you cannot be complacent and just wait for a time when the prices are down again because of obvious reasons of energy security, security supply, and climate change, and also just renewal of the energy system. So yeah, that's the new situation in the market.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much. Sharanya?
I completely agree with what Peter said. I think it's up to the regulators and the government bodies now to look at how these projects are funded going forward. I think it's fair to say that the UK's CFD round was a stark example of how things will keep going if nothing changes. There is some positives in the sense that conversations are starting to come forward now, in the UK at least, in terms of this dilemma. But I think it's fair to say that at least in the UK, it's very much become more of a political game, the offshore wind market, in terms of its role, rather than looking at it, like Peter said, as a critical infrastructure that's needed for the world to keep moving. And I think it's also worthwhile, I know this is an offshore wind focused webinar, but to look at it as a whole in terms of energy, because this is not only just happening in offshore wind, this is happening across all sectors. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed holistically across the whole board so that we can all move forward, and not only offshore wind is benefited, but all of the energy sectors. And I think with the inflation crisis, not only does it trickle down the supply chain to the smaller companies who are moving over back to oil and gas, but it also, there are a number of other challenges within offshore wind that need to be addressed on top of this, like again, the standardization of floating foundations, the lack of ports in many countries, the grid capacity that we mentioned. So I think for the next few years at least, although the pipelines are looking great in terms of numbers, I don't see much change in terms of the shelved projects and the stalled outcomes on this front. But it is an industry that will keep moving simply because it has to. It's something that we need, it's not something that we desire. So yeah, we'll see what happens over the next few years.
Okay, Sharanya, thank you very much. Klint?
Yeah, I think I very much agree with my two co-panelists here. I think maybe one thing worthy of mentioning is the issue in terms of the race from the OEMs to continue to build bigger turbines with more capacity. And just prior to launching this webinar, I saw a headline news that Vestas was actually looking into that now and really aggressively making communication into the market that needs to stop. Maybe that's not a really a new thing, but at least it's something that needs to be addressed to build actually on the capacity rather than concentrate the energy on building bigger turbines, because the production capacity is really a key issue in the supplier market as I see it right now. I think maybe one additional point is I very much agree that policymakers is obviously by nature perhaps a bit slower in reacting to the market than the market itself, and that's probably just how it is. I think that's one of the strengths with the Danish model. It's really listening into the market and being adaptive, and that needs to happen everywhere and increasingly so. I think the next connection will be to power to X and creation of fuels, and that's potentially where you can cover some of the gap in terms of lack of ability to build the grid, that you'll be able to then connect to power to X and build an infrastructure around fuels and e-fuels especially.
Okay, Klint, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very important topic, and let's see how it's going to develop over the next few months and then potentially years. So that marks the end of this webinar. So I once again invite all of you to our grant event next year in Barcelona, and until end of October we have early bird ticket price, so feel free to use this opportunity and register and attend in person in Barcelona. Usually it's a very nice and lovely weather there, even in January, February, so come and enjoy some time, and also great discussions and presentations by quite senior speakers, and also build a network. And yeah, that will be a great event. Feel free to register for this. And as for today's event, thank you very much, Peter, Sharanya, and Klint, for sharing your views today, for answering questions. It was a pleasure to have you, and see you next time. And for now, bye and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Have a good day.